Wel, noswaith dda iawn i chi gyd a chroeso cynnes iawn i chi i webinar Cyswllt Ffermio. Eirwen Williams ydw i a heno rydyn ni'n trafod y papur gwyn ar amaeth. Good evening to you all and a very warm welcome to Family Connect's webinar. I'm Eirwen Williams and I will be chairing the meeting tonight where we'll be discussing the Welsh Government's Agriculture White Paper. Fel ych chi'n gwybod, mae'r papur gwyn ar amaeth yn cynnig un o'r newidiadau mwyaf yn hermau polisi amaeth Cymru ers degawdau. A felly bwriad y cyfarfod yma heno yw i roi cyfle i ni i ddod i wybod mwy am gefndir a hefyd cynnwys y papur gwyn, a hefyd i roi cyfle i chi i holi cwestiynau ac i gael atebion i'r cwestiynau hynny. Mae croeso i chi anfon eich cwestiynau i mewn unrhyw bryd yn ystod y noson. Allwch chi drwy anfon nhw, teipio nhw i mewn, a mae croeso chi i holi nhw yn Gymraeg, yn Saesneg. Allwch chi hefyd anfon nhw mewn yn ddienw os ych chi moyn. Fel nes i sôn hefyd, i ni'n gobeithio byddwn ni'n cadw'r cyfarfod i awr o hyd, felly os bydd y gwestiynau heb cael eu hateb ar ddiwedd y cyfarfod, mi fyddwn ni bydd Llywodraeth Cymru wedi cytuno i roi atebion iddyn ni'r cwestiynau hynny, a mi fyddwn ni'n anfon y cwestiynau hynny allan at bob un sydd wedi cymryd rhan yn y cyfarfod heno dros e-bost, a mi fydd copi hefyd ar gael ar wefan Llywodraeth Cymru. Felly, yn siaradwr gwadd am heno yw James Owen, dirprwy gyfarwyddwr Adran Diwygio Rheoli Tir Llywodraeth Cymru. Mae James yn gyfrifol am arwen y rhaglen i sicrhau bod ffermio Cymru yn gynaliadwy ar gyfer cenedlaethau'r dyfodol. Mae hyn yn cynnwys dylunio polisi ar sail tystiolaeth a datblygu fframwaith deddfwriaethol sylfaenol. Felly, pwy well i gyflwyno heno na James? A gyda hynna o eiriau, hoffwn ddiolch i James am ymuno gyda ni heno, a hoffwn i drosglwyddo'r awennau i chi. A very warm welcome, James.
Diolch, Iwan. Noswaith dda pawb. I'm really grateful for everyone's time this evening, and it's great to be here, albeit virtually. Much prefer to be out and about if we could during this consultation period, but sadly, because of events, it's constrained us to being behind this desk here in Bedwas. But I'm really grateful for everyone for the time and really welcome the opportunity to talk to you about our consultation on our white paper. I'm going to share some slides, so I will check with Iwan that she can see them when they come up.
Yes, we can see them, James.
You got the slides, brilliant. Okay, I was generally like talking to people in person, of course, and with that you can use a barometer of how engaged people are when they're looking at you and whether they're engaging with what we're saying. However, obviously, I've got a different kind of measure of success tonight. I can see the number of participants now. I'm hoping it will be around the same when I finish talking, which will be in about 20 minutes' time. So let's see how we go. As I say, thank you, Iwan, for the introduction. We'll be talking about the white paper tonight. I think I'll just start with context and just outline broadly how we've got to the publication. Of course, the new policy framework in Wales is as a direct consequence of our leaving the EU and the end of the transition period, which happened at the end of last year. We see that inside government as a real challenge and an opportunity for Wales to create a Made in Wales policy framework for agriculture for the future. And I think it's really important to say that, that there is that opportunity for us to do something different in Wales. Policy in this space has devolved, the ability to legislate in this space has devolved, and Welsh ministers have a real ambition for, creating a fantastic opportunity for viable farm business in the future, alongside some of the real challenges that we know we face. First and foremost of those challenges is, of course, continue to produce food sustainably. So, absolutely, the future of agriculture for us is about sustainable food production, but also thinking about the wider contribution that we know farmers and land managers can make to the fight against the climate and nature emergencies that we face. And in that context, we think it's really important that we maintain the high standards and the high quality of produce that's made that's already operating in Wales. This opportunity to create our own system of support and legislation, is not an opportunity to kind of drive down against those high standards, because we think agriculture in Wales will have a real opportunity, if you like, in future marketplaces across the globe, and to compete on grounds other than solely cost. And we think, the high production standards combined with the sustainable production of food and the way that we produce food in Wales will be a real market advantage to the production of food in Wales and the market opportunities that future trade deals can present. So many of you who will no doubt have followed this area over the last couple of years will know that this is our third consultation in just about 3 years. So soon after Brexit, we published Brexit on Our Land, and then 2019, Sustainable Farming Our Land. And there we really developed our proposals for a new system of agricultural support. And we're incredibly grateful for the 12,000 or so responses we got to Brexit on Our Land, and in excess of 5,000 to Sustainable Farming Our Land, because they've really helped us develop our policy propositions over the 3 years since that original purpose. The white paper in many ways is the next step in the process. It sets out really the strategic framework that we're expecting to develop in terms of the legislation that's needed to make the changes that we're going to talk about tonight. And key to that strategic framework is the principle of sustainable land management. We've talked about this in our previous consultation, but in essence, it's derived from the existing legislative framework which exists in Wales, which is unique to Wales, and we should be proud of, I believe, in Wales. The framework created by the Wellbeing of Future Generations and Environment Acts. Those acts set out the kind of legal requirements for all government policy and thinking in the future, and it is very much focused on principles around sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, I think we're really clear about what that means to us. For us, of course, it has to mean economic sustainability. So we want to have viable and profitable farm businesses in the future. It's absolutely about social sustainability, and that recognises very much that farms and farmers, are often at the heart of the rural communities throughout Wales and play such a vital contribution to those communities. And maintaining and sustaining that, not least in the context of the Welsh language, is absolutely vital to the government. But of course, sustainability's third angle is around the environment, and recognising that we have got significant challenges globally and in Wales around responding to the climate and nature emergencies we face. And we really see farming as part of the solution, not as a problem. So designing our future land management policy around sustainable land management, we believe, gives us the opportunity to look at all three aspects of sustainability: social, economic and environmental. And we've set that out in the white paper. So the white paper, in essence, sets out our proposals to bring forward legislation in the Senedd after the next election. The proposals are deliberately strategic in scope. They propose that we set out a framework for agriculture and forestry within Wales for the next 15 to 20 years. And we think that's really important because, of course, we need to have legislation in place that can respond to events. And, over the last year, we've seen how important it is to see, to enable government to respond to events around, the pandemic and COVID. And, we know that legislation and the framework we create around legislation needs to stand the test of time. So they're broad powers, they're strategic powers, but in essence, we're talking about three key areas. Now, there's lots of detail in the white paper, and if you have a chance to look at it, we'd be really grateful. But we do accept that it's there are some fairly detailed provisions in there. But if I was going to boil it down into three key themes for you, I'd talk about the powers that we're seeking to take for Welsh ministers to create a new sustainable farm scheme, and this is a scheme to replace the previous EU-funded scheme for farmers. So the basic payment scheme from Pillar 1 and some of the direct-to-farm payments that we make through Pillar 2, through the Rural Development Programme. The second big area of our proposals is around the introduction of national minimum standards, which we propose that should be applicable to all farmers in Wales and backed by civil sanctions. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment. And a big chunk of our third section is recognising the fact that we took some time-limited powers through the UK Agriculture Act last year, which was really to ensure continuity and stability for the agriculture sector in the next couple of years. That was partly in the context of Brexit, of course, making sure that we can continue with farm payments whilst we developed a Made in Wales approach to farm payments in the future. So as I talked about, there are three key elements of the white paper which set out proposals for the Sustainable Farm Scheme, the national minimum standards, and our proposals to replace some of the powers that Welsh ministers have taken through the UK Agriculture Act. So I'll just talk about each of those elements, I think, because they'll generate, I hope, some questions and some thoughts in all of you. So I'll start off by the Sustainable Farm Scheme. And if you've had a chance to read our previous consultations, particularly Sustainable Farming Our Land, you'll see what our proposals look like in relation to replacing the basic payment scheme in Wales. In essence, we're talking about public money for public goods. So, government providing payments, revenue payments to farmers for the actions that they take on their land in exchange, in essence, for the environmental outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. And I think it's really important to say here that what we're proposing through this sustainable farm scheme is a land sharing approach. So we very much want these public goods that we're talking about to operate in harmony with the continued production of food in Wales. So this is where our kind of ambition of sustainable food production comes in. The types of things that we as government are seeking to buy, you can see some of them on the list there: improved soils, clean air and clean water, ecosystem resilience, animal health and welfare. Those are the types of things that, obviously farmers are not paid for by the market at the moment, but we as government, deem absolutely essential in the response to the climate and nature emergencies I've talked about before. So, in practice, what will this mean for farmers? Well, it will mean a range of actions that we would ask them to undertake on farm in relation to these areas, alongside, as I say, food production to deliver some of these outcomes. Now, the two questions I always get asked, are, particularly when I was out and about around Wales, when we first started doing some consultation around this, was exactly what do you want me to do and how much are you going to get paid? Well, I think the most important thing for us to say is we are still developing the detailed evidence that needs to support the link between the outcomes that we're seeking. So those 4 outcomes are examples of those you can see on the list, and the actions that will deliver those actions. And we're also working very hard to demonstrate the payment rates that should go alongside that. But I think it's really important to say in relation to those payment rates, what we are looking to do is replace the income foregone and costs incurred model that you would have seen in the EU with a model that recognises the value, if you like, the societal value to a degree of some of the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. So we haven't got the answers to those specific questions yet, but I can't stress enough that our proposals around land sharing, so working in harmony really with food production to deliver some of those environmental outcomes that we're talking about. So the white paper talks about our proposals for the sustainable farming scheme and the powers that we'll need to introduce it. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about when we might see that coming into effect. If we can go on, Fionn, to the national minimum standards slide, please. So the second big element of our white paper proposals are around the national minimum standards. Now, this is really something that we've been working quite hard on since our previous consultation, to come up with proposals to ensure that regulation in Wales is appropriate and proportionate and effective. Now, at the moment, we obviously have a patchwork of legislation in place, which is largely driven from EU and domestic law, which manifests itself through the cross-compliant, easy for me to say, cross-compliance requirements that many farmers will understand from their BPS payments. This is a really complex landscape. So what we want to do through the national minimum standards is to effectively consolidate that complex landscape and make it much simpler for people and farmers to understand what legal requirements they must comply with. It's also an opportunity for us to look at those cross-compliance requirements and understand, understand which ones of those are still appropriate, and also understand where we've got critical gaps. But I think the most important thing that I would stress probably today is that what we're seeking to do initially is we're seeking to consolidate existing law. So what we're trying to do is make it far simpler for farmers in Wales to understand what those requirements, those existing requirements already are, what compliance with those means, and to make sure there's a proportionate and effective way of enforcing those. And in that effect, the white paper also proposes the introduction of civil sanctions. So at the moment, cross-compliance can often mean the disallowance of payments if you're receiving payments for government for all sorts of reasons under EU law. But it also can mean criminal sanctions for more egregious breaches. Well, we think that there's, to make sure that those standards are enforced proportionally in the future, there must be there should be introduced a civil sanctions regime. And I think, from our perspective, what we're seeking to do is work with the industry to provide advice, guidance and support to ensure compliance with the standards, rather than always resorting to fines or certainly criminal prosecution. And we think that's really important to make sure that it's proportionate, because, when we have a consolidated law in place, we want to make sure that it's as easy for farmers as possibly can be to comply with the regulation that we put into effect. So you'll see in the white paper, our views on how we, if you like, start with advice and compliance, and then move advice and guidance, and then we move through various stages of compliance to things like stop notices or cease and desist notices, through to the potential for fines. But I can't stress enough really that this is about consolidating existing practice and then making sure that it's like proportionate for enforcement to the nature of any breaches of those standards. Thank you, Fiona. Can we move to the next slide, please? I don't know if you can move us. There we go. So I've talked a little bit about the evidence, and conscious of time and giving everyone an opportunity for questions. What we're doing alongside this programme of work to support the white paper is developing a significant evidence base. The key piece of evidence that we're working on at the moment is the economic analysis that supports our proposals. So this will really, in effect, give us some evidence about the impact of our proposals on farms and farm businesses. We want to make sure that the scheme that we're developing is accessible to all, and we really need to understand the impact that it will have on farm businesses from a cost effectiveness and profitability perspective. So over the course of the next year, we'll be undertaking a range of different analyses to understand the impacts of these proposals, and also to map out the benefits that we hope to achieve, particularly the environmental benefits. We hope to be able to publish a report on the findings of this later in the autumn, and that will really, I think, start to set out, if you like, in a bit more detail, the second half of that question around, so if I undertake these actions on my farm in the future, what would be the likely payment rate for me? So significant amount of work going into evidence. So if we move to the next slide, I'll also talk to you about the engagement that we've been undertaking as well. So last year we engaged with around about 2,000 farmers who fed in their views into our co-design proposals. What we were trying to do here really was share some of our thinking about the scheme, what it might look like, and what are the types of things that we might incorporate into it, and really get some views from farmers about what might work and what we might want to go back and have a look at. We're very close to finalising the report on that, and we'll publish that as soon as it's available. And we're keen for this kind of partnership with the sector to continue. I mean, I think, clearly from our perspective, the ability to engage with so many farmers last year in these co-design workshops gave us great insight into the types of actions that we might be able to introduce into the scheme. But from my perspective, it was also fascinating to hear the knowledge transfer that went in on those sessions. And, there was really good sharing of information between, farmers in different sectors and different parts of the country on some best practice and good ideas for, no doubt that farm businesses could take forward. So we're keen for that to continue, and we intend to do another session of co-design again towards the end of this year. Now, if you can move to the next slide. So what does all this mean in terms of transition, standing here in 2021? Well, the Minister's confirmed that BPS will continue this year. And so that's essentially as is. You will have seen our proposals, hopefully last year, on simplifying some elements of the basic payment scheme, which will come into effect this year. And, hopefully consolidating and simplifying some of that will make everyone's life a little bit easier in the interim. And I hope you've also seen that the Minister announced their intention to continue again with BPS in 2022. Now, of course, I have to put the caveat around that being subject to UK government funding. They have committed to that through the life cycle of this Parliament, but you may have seen that we've had some disagreements, particularly around the precise amounts that came through from the last budget settlement from the UK government. So in essence, I think what we can expect to see in the next 2 years is a continuation of the same. And that's, we think that's really important as we develop our proposals to give some stability to the industry, not least as we kind of assess the full impact of Brexit in terms of trade markets. I think the next thing to say is, we've been really clear that we're not going to make any changes until we've got the evidence to support that those changes are the right ones for Wales. So I'll go back to my the previous slide and the talking around evidence there. We need to understand the impact of our proposals, and we need to be confident that we can administer this in a proper way. So, developing that evidence base, listening to farmers, engaging with them through the co-design process is absolutely essential in terms of bringing forward these changes. Having said that, we do need to act. We do need to bring forward powers in a Wales bill, and that's because this is a devolved area, and we need whatever the evidence of co-design tells us to have an ability to introduce new proposals and schemes. And so we do intend to introduce a bill after the Senedd elections into the Senedd, which will start, if you like, the process of transitioning to the new schemes that I've just talked about. And I think the target at the moment for us is to start that transition in 2024. So if we introduce legislation into the Senedd in 22, we seek royal assent in 23, and then we start the process of the transition to the new scheme and the national minimum standards in 24. And I think it's really finally important to say, you know, throughout this process, we've always talked about the support that needs to be made available. And, you know, in part, that will be financial support through the continuation of the existing schemes and, you know, maintaining stability and continuity in this time period. But it will also be about the advice that we provide to farmers to help them transition effectively into the new ways of working. I think we see transition as a process, not an event. So we see that taking place over a number of years, whereby we support farmers to change and adapt as necessary to the proposals that we've put out in the scheme. If we go to my last slide, if you may, Fionn. So what does this all mean? So the white paper's out for consultation now, and, you know, as I say, these are our proposals, which we've set out in the white paper. So we're really grateful for your views and your opinions on that. So please, if you do have time, you know, visit our website, have a read of the consultation, and fill in the forms to give us your responses. You know, this is the third consultation in 3 years. I think if you followed this journey with us over the last 3 years, you'll see how the proposals have evolved over that time, and that's, you know, in no small way down to the input of stakeholders, but also farmers who've contributed directly to our consultations. Our plan then is to publish a summary of the responses after the election, alongside the Welsh Government policy response, and we hope to be able to publish alongside that further details about the scheme, the economic analysis, and of course then lead into our second phase of co-design, where we can talk in more detail about the next stages of what the scheme might look like. So if you like, that's our timetable as we move towards the bill coming into effect, and as I say, a transition towards the new arrangements in Wales from around 2024. Now, conscious of time, and partly down to my technical errors, I think I've spoken a bit longer than I probably intended to. So I'm going to hand back to Iowyn, and really looking forward to your questions and comments. Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr, James. Mynd trwy hwnna. Diolch hefyd I Fionn am ddod i'r adwy gyda'r problemau technegol. Fi'n gweld bod yna un cwestiwn fan hyn ynglyn â'r sleidiau. Mae'r sleidiau, fel o'ch chi'n gweld, yn Saesneg, ond mae yna gopïau Cymraeg o'r sleidiau gael hefyd, a mi fyddwn ni yn gallu darparu reina I bwy bynnag sydd ysyn nhw yn Gymraeg neu yn Saesneg. Fi'n credu falle bod ni angen anfon ddwy fersiwn mas I bawb yn dilyn y cyfarfod yma. Felly, ewn ni mlaen i'r cwestiynau, a fel o'n i'n dweud, mae croeso chi I gadw I anfon y cwestiynau mewn, eto yn Gymraeg neu yn Saesneg. Felly, na ddechrau gyda'r cwestiwn cyntaf sydd wedi dod mewn heno. I'll start with the first question, James. From Geraint Powell, thank you, Geraint. Will future policy recognise and reward the ability of well-managed herbivores that enhance ecosystem function and biodiversity on grasslands?
So our proposals are to encourage actions on farm to enable animals, to enable farms to produce food sustainably. So what are we talking about there? I mean, we're talking about a variety of actions that can be undertaken, you know, now, and many farmers do. I think I know Geraint actually, so I'm well aware of his farming, and exactly that type of action that we would seek to see, because it delivers the environmental outcomes that we're seeking. So what we propose to do is have a range of actions that you know, should be applicable to farms in Wales around animal health, around nutrient management, around creating effective habitats that farmers can undertake alongside food production, and for which we will then reward them.
Thank you. Another question that's come in on, will the white paper get the go-ahead if there is a change of government in May, or do we go back to the drawing board?
That's a good question for a humble civil servant in a period leading up to an election. So I think there's two things I'd probably say. I mean, obviously the political parties in Wales will no doubt be publishing their proposals in their manifestos for agricultural policy. You know, I think you know, I'd encourage you all to read those with interest as you make your minds up about the election that's coming later in this year. Having said that, you know, we have taken time-limited powers from the UK Agriculture Act in Wales to enable continuity and stability over the next couple of years. But they are time-limited powers. Any government coming in after the election is going to have to do something in this space if it wants to continue operating BPS as is, or changing to the kind of system that we're proposing. And that will mean introducing primary legislation into the Senedd. because by the end of 2024, the government will have had to have acted in this space in Wales in order to make any payments or to run any scheme, because that's the nature of devolution.
And what about the difference between the English Environmental Land Management Scheme, the ELM scheme, and what's planned for Wales? If devolution is being implemented here in Wales, why is it so similar to England rather than developing a bespoke scheme for Wales?
Well, I would probably say flattery is the most sincere form of imitation. Or imitation of the most sincere form of flattery even. I think if you followed our policy development process over the last 3 years and England's policy development process over that time, you might see that the Welsh proposals were actually out, far earlier than anything that came out around ELMS. Having said that, it's not for me to stand here and talk really about English policy. It's for me to talk about Welsh policy. And I think we're very proud about the ambition we have for farming in Wales, working in harmony in that land sharing approach alongside the sustainable food production, but, playing a vital part, an integral part into the nation's response to the climate and nature emergencies that we face.
Yeah, thank you, James. Moving on to the next question then, and plus a concern by a lot of farmers really about the paperwork. Are you going to ensure that paperwork is manageable and fair for all?
Yes, I mean, I think, the minister's on record in saying that, we need to take the opportunity of leaving the EU to make this as administratively simple and practical as we possibly can. And, you've started to see some of the changes that we can already introduce in Wales through the simplification consultation that we launched last year to make the existing schemes simpler and easier to administer. We certainly need to take the lessons from, years of running common agricultural policy schemes in Wales with us as we move to the new scheme. We also need to think about the effective use of technology, and I mean technology in the widest sense for how farm payments are administered, but also the technology that can be used on farm to ensure effective monitoring, and sensing of the different types of things that we're seeking to do. So, yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, we will want to make this as simple and as administratively easy for farmers as we possibly can, and we will support them in that process as well. A key tenet of our proposals is around an advisory service, which will be there with the farmers through the transition period to help them move from the current systems to the new.
Thank you, James. There's another question, really, and again, something that it does concern a lot of farmers. And I understand payment for desired outcomes, but what if we are already taking actions such as avoiding fertilizers and sprays, improving soils? Will we be paid for continuing what we are already doing?
Yes, in essence, yeah. So what we're going to reward is the management of land, in essence, so sustainable land management. And if farmers are already undertaking the actions which are delivering the outcomes that we want, and it does mean taking action. It doesn't just mean leaving the land alone. If they're already managing in that way, we'll publish our what the requirements are for the scheme. Farmers who are already doing that should find the transitional, very, very straightforward and very simple.
One clarification question here. What do you mean by land sharing?
Okay, so land sharing is a concept really of agriculture, so food production operating alongside the natural environment. So we don't want to go to a process of agricultural intensification or of rewilding or another aspect of that where land is either taken out of production or put into intensive production. We want the land in Wales, which is a great deal of it, over 80% is already used for agricultural practices, to continue to produce food, but at the same time to be managed in a way that can deliver environmental benefits. So a sharing approach, if you like, between the agricultural products and the environmental outcomes that we're seeking.
Following on from that then, James, there's a comment here. I think land sharing is a very dangerous phrase. It suggests opening up private land and farming businesses to the public. Are there any other phrases that can be used? Okay, no, so thank you for the feedback on that. I hadn't heard that it had been used in that context before. We'll certainly take that on board. We'll have a think about that. I mean, I think we use it in a very particular way around, as I mentioned, agriculture and environment operating in harmony together. But we'll certainly take that feedback on board and consider its use. Another question has come in about the sort of practicality of the scheme. How soon can we expect to see some sort of pilot farms or trialling of future schemes? Also, there is very little discussion being about future common land policy and schemes. So 2 questions in one there, to be honest.
Yeah. So in terms of test trials and case studies, you know, we, as I mentioned, we hope to be able to publish further details on the scheme later this year, and our next phase of co-design later this year as well. And we hope that that will lead into a test and trials type of approach and phase of the programme. You know, I talked about our transition starting in 2024, and I think that gives us a nice opportunity to test some of the, you know, on land already under management in Wales, test some of those proposals as we run into the scheme. And that's important for a couple of reasons. You know, one, we need to demonstrate quite clearly, I think, that the actions are feasible. So the actions that that we ask farmers to undertake are feasible on different types of farms in Wales. 2, that they deliver the benefits that we're seeking in terms of the environmental outcomes. And 3, going just back to that point, to ensure that it's administrative, you know, we can make it work for the whole of Wales. We can make the scheme work, administer it across the whole of Wales. So, you know, certainly as we come to the end of this year and our next co-design, we'll be looking at how we can develop those ideas even further into some, you know, practical examples on land in Wales. Coming back to the common land question, sorry, Iwan, I missed it, sorry.
Yes, there's very little discussion being about future common land policy and scheme. So are there any thoughts with Welsh Government how that will develop in future?
Yeah, and yeah, again, I think recognising that the volume of land in Wales that is under common land arrangements, you know, it is important that the scheme does incorporate an ability for actions to be undertaken on common land. Now, by the nature of how common land is currently organised, we kind of recognise that that is a more complex beast, if you like, than, you know, farmland that is under ownership. But, you know, absolutely, we need to make sure that the scheme does reflect the actions that can be taken on common land because of the opportunity, if you like, there for delivering the types of benefits that we're talking about. When we go back to talking about tests and trials and things like that, I think it's absolutely essential that when we do that, we test it in areas like common land, and we test it with, you know, graziers associations and the like, to ensure that you know, the schemes can work at a level beyond the individual farm.
There's 2 questions next on enforcement. So regarding enforcement, will there be a right to appeal and will there be an independent arbitrator?
Yeah, so our proposals will have to have an ability for farmers to appeal any decisions that are made through that enforcement regime, and you know, they will have to have an independence to that appeal process. I think that goes without saying. But I think I would reiterate our kind of intent here, if you like, around enforcement. You know, our intent is to make it as easy as we possibly can for farmers in Wales to comply with the existing legislation that's already in place. And we think the way to do that is through advice, support and guidance in the interim. And it's only really when we get to the more kind of egregious breaches of, you know, existing regulation that we should be considering more, you know, different forms of civil sanction or indeed criminal enforcement. So, you know, I'll go back to that point about trying to make this as a system that's proportionate, but is actually based on a clear policy intent to make it as easy as we possibly can for farmers to comply with the existing law.
And the other question, or perhaps is more like a comment, to be honest, would you agree that set levels of fines are not proportionate and favour the bigger farmers? Would percentage fines be better?
Yeah, well, you know, I would really encourage whoever put that question in to respond to our consultation with that opinion. I think what we need to make sure, as I've said, is that it's proportionate. So proportionate to the type of breach that's occurred. You know, and we know at the moment that the Common Agricultural Policy doesn't always feel fair to those farmers who have a disallowance payment, for example. You know, because of a technical error or a field work error or a paperwork error. You know, those are exactly the types of things we would seek to remove from a future legal system. And then absolutely, I think before we get to a position where we'd be seeking to you know, enforce any fines in relation to the farmers, again, I think, you know, we'd be looking at actually, well, what's the damage that's done to the environment and what's the restitution that could be done as a result of that by the farmer, and to enforce that proportionally. So I think, you know, I'd welcome that kind of response coming into the consultation if that's what the author of the question believes. I think absolutely right. We need to think about the principle of a set regime against a flexible regime. It is a complex piece of work because it is changing. In essence, the current cross compliance the current cross compliance and legislative framework that underpins it in both the EU and domestic law.
Thank you. Moving on then perhaps to young people coming into the industry, and this question here about retirement. Will there be a retirement package to enable older farmers to hand over to their sons or daughters, I would add perhaps to that, and still receive a form of income?
So it's not part of our current proposals to have a retirement package for farmers.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier the use of technology. Will there be consent or support for new technology? For example, the new electric GPS livestock collars replacing electric fencing that I'm told are currently not supported. What process is there for new technology to go through to be approved?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, a key part of our proposals is around the if you like, the capital elements that might support sustainable land management principles in the future. And we think the use of technology, whether it be remote sensing or whether it be, livestock sensing, we think can play a huge part in that. So, again, we'd be really interested in, people's opinions on what type of technology would really help with some of these land management proposals. We of course have a number of schemes that we run at the moment, SPG and FBG through our rural development programme in particular, and thinking about how those schemes operate in the next couple of years as we transition to the new scheme, and then beyond that, in terms of the capital works that we support, we think is really important. So, any ideas on that welcomed.
Thank you. One straightforward question here. So if BPS is the same for 2021 and 2022, and transition starts in 2024, what happens in 2023?
Very sharp question, Matt. So one of the reasons why, of course, 2023 hasn't been confirmed yet is because we have an election this year. So again, I would say watch this space in terms of the political manifestos that are out in terms of their intention to that. It's very difficult for a government towards the end of its term to make commitments that bind a new government. But I think realistically, the time frame that we've set out is challenging to deliver in terms of both what needs to happen from a government perspective and a Senate perspective to enable a transition to start in 2024, which is likely to mean that any incoming government, would only have so many options about what it could do in 2023. We simply won't have legislation in place, I don't believe, in 2023 to enable a new scheme to come into effect.
Okay. There's a few questions that have come in on organic. Are we likely to see an organic scheme in the future?
So our proposal is quite clear that we're looking at a single sustainable farming scheme, which should be accessible to all farmers. So all farmers and farm businesses should be able to look into that. And so within that, there should certainly be a place for organics. I mean, I think some of the practices that many farmers and organic farmers potentially in particular are already undertaking may well be the types of things that, we would propose under the new scheme. So, the new scheme is not an organic scheme, but I think some of the types of land management practices that many organic farmers are already undertaking will stand them in good stead for, whether they consider coming into the new scheme.
And following on from that, then there's a question here asking about schemes such as the organic scheme and Glassdair. It says, what will happen to Glassdair schemes, Glassdair Advanced and Organic in 2022 and 2023? I am in both, and it's frustrating they are effectively frozen and I can't add new land in, for example.
Yeah, so, the government hasn't made a decision on that at the moment, I'm afraid, so I can understand your frustration. We do know that, part of the reason for that is, of course, the financial uncertainty that the Welsh Government has had to deal with over the last couple of years. Now that the money isn't coming from the EU in the same way that it was, we'll look to the UK government to make good their commitments about not a penny less. Unfortunately, you may have seen played out in the press that hasn't been the case in the last settlement, and that we feel that Wales has been shortchanged by the UK government in respect of the budget allocation for the next year. But yeah, I do understand the frustration around those types of schemes for 22 and 23. I guess rest assured that we're very conscious of the need to make decisions on that sooner rather than later, so that farm businesses can plan for the future accordingly. And I'm sure it will be on the plate of a new government after the election.
Thank you. We've talked about farmers, but there's a question here about foresters.
Yeah.
Having read the white paper, there is no support being offered to foresters and owners of forest land. The only mention is of more regulation for forests. Have I read this correctly?
Well, so it is an agriculture white paper. There are proposals in the white paper about forestry, particularly about giving ministers powers around environmental impact assessments and the like. And so there are proposals in there, not necessarily around regulation, but about the creation of forestry. I think what I would say is, of course, naturally the focus of these proposals are around agriculture and replacing the common agricultural policy. But if you look at the wider Welsh Government policy landscape, if you like, and our proposals for a national forest and the support for sustainable timber production in Wales, there's much more beyond, I guess, in terms of the government's proposals around supporting forestry in the future.
And moving on to the budget, would the future budget following the transition be expected to be similar to the current budget?
Well, I think that's $1 million question. Sorry to use a pun. I think what we can say with some certainty is that the Welsh Labour government had committed, obviously, to maintaining funding for the lifetime of this Senedd term. The UK government in Westminster, in the Conservative Party manifesto, committed to ring-fencing funding until the end of the next Parliament. But I think it's important to be honest and say, well, we don't really know what the position will be thereafter. One really important point to note, I guess, is that we have to justify in many ways the continued amount of money that goes into this sector, and the budget will undoubtedly be subject to more local scrutiny than ever before, because decisions on the budget will be taken in the Senedd by Welsh ministers and voted on accordingly there. So I think we have some certainty for the immediate future. I think it will depend on future governments about what commitments they want to make. And of course, I think for us, in terms of the agriculture sector, it's really important that we justify the value. And I'll go back to my points about sustainable land management here. The value that farming and farm businesses pay to rural communities, to the social fabric of our communities. We need to demonstrate that. We need to demonstrate that they're making a difference in terms of the economy of those rural communities and supporting viable businesses in those areas. And of course, I think we need to demonstrate the environmental difference, because so much of land is under agricultural management. The environmental benefits that the continued support of farming would justify. So I think it's really imperative that we do that to make the best possible case we can to retain and protect those budgets.
And on the transition again, can you just clarify for how long will it last? The transition period from 2024.
So we haven't made a final decision on the exact length of time, but we're talking about multiple years. I think. I think in the Sustainable Farming Our Land consultation, we asked for ideas about how long it lasts. I think 5 years is a period of time that people have often talked about. And whilst we haven't made a decision on that, I think what we're trying to do is, over that transition period, bring everyone into the scheme and have them operating over that period. So by the end of that period, effectively in the new scheme. So, we're not looking for a cliff edge here. We're looking for a managed approach to transitioning from a system that's been in place for decades into something new. So that will take multiple years.
And if the transition doesn't start until 2024, and some farmers may want to improve the environment on their farm before then, will they be rewarded for this retrospectively or penalised by not being paid?
Well, we wouldn't be making retrospective payments for a scheme we haven't introduced. I think it's clear to say. I go back to the point about we are going to be paying for the action that's taken on land. So if that action is already taken by farmers, then it's going to be a heck of a lot easier for them to demonstrate entry to the scheme, get into the scheme and be up and running as soon as it's available. because it's not about saying, well, because you already do it, we're not going to pay you that anymore. It's about continuing that existing good practice so that we can deliver the environmental outcomes we're seeking.
There's one comment here from a hill farmer. He says, as a marginal hill farmer, my business can only survive with subsidies. After reading the document, I cannot see how continuance of support will continue. So just a concern there from an anonymous attendee.
No, I think it's a good question. I'll go back to the evidence piece of work that we're doing. So we've always been clear that the scheme needs to be available to all different types of farms in Wales, different sectors, different regions, different types of farms. And so part of developing our evidence base is to prove, if you like, that the types of actions that we're seeking to deliver on farms, alongside the payment rates, will enable those farms to become part of the scheme and will enable them to be viable in the future. So, I mean, we absolutely recognise those concerns, but, we're working on developing the evidence base, which will enable us to demonstrate, if you like, that all different types of farms in Wales could enter the scheme, and that the payment rates would be recognise, if you like, the value of the environmental outcomes they're delivering. So going beyond that kind of income forgone and costs incurred model that we see at the moment.
We don't envy the task you've got of making this scheme, fair for every type of farm and every sector across the whole of Wales. So there's one question here asking something about how will fairness be built into the system? Current payments on the environment are loaded to certain areas, with some being disadvantaged against by the location.
Okay, so again, I'll go back to, I think our proposals for the scheme talk about the actions that should be available on farm to deliver those types of, improved soils, habitat management, animal health and welfare that we've talked about previously. And we do believe that, the majority of those actions should be available to the majority of farms. I think we do need to recognise that, there will be some complexity because, no farm in Wales is the same. So we need to work through that complexity, but we do need to ensure that the payment rates are proportionately affected to the action that's undertaken, if that makes sense. So we want to make sure that, as many farms as possible in Wales come into the scheme. And why do we want that? Well, because, frankly, we want to buy the benefits of farmers, the public goods that we've talked about in terms of clean air, clean water, carbon capture, etc. We as government are looking to buy them. So we want to make it as attractive as we possibly can, but recognising obviously that, that will have to be within the constraints of whatever budget is agreed in future years.
Thank you. One specific question here. Will farmers be rewarded for land being allowed to flood in order to protect housing? Possibly. That would be part of a detailed scheme proposal. If I'm honest, I haven't counted that in our scheme design as yet. That might be a very niche part of the scheme in certain areas of Wales. But I think if you've got ideas on that, again, I'd encourage you to respond to our consultation, and it's something we can certainly look at alongside our water and flood colleagues here in the Welsh Government. There's one question here on horticulture and arable. The consultation states that the proposals will lead to an increase in arable and horticulture. What kind of support will be on offer to achieve this?
Yeah, so I mean, support in the widest sense, I think, from the Welsh Government. We've talked about the revenue support that we're seeking to, provide in the future through the Sustainable Farming Scheme. If you've had a chance to read the white paper, you'll also see the business and supply chain support that we're looking to provide. So, how can we support, new farm businesses and new farm ventures, if you like, to be successful and flourish, and support in the widest possible sense through advice. Potentially through capital grants, potentially through knowledge transfer and ability of CPD and ability to develop CPD. So we certainly look at supporting all of those aspects. And I think one of the reasons we want the potentially an increase in the horticulture and arable sectors to thrive is because we want to make sure that we have as shorter supply chains as we possibly can in Wales, and thinking about those sectors in particular, there may be opportunities to help shorten some of those supply chains and develop businesses in a way that perhaps they haven't been supported to be done under the Common Agricultural Policy.
you mentioned there the advice. Can people choose who they use for the advisory service, or will they have to pick from an approved list?
Good question. We haven't determined that yet, I'm afraid. I mean, I think what we're talking about here really is an advisory service in the most holistic sense. We kind of recognise that different farmers might require advice for different things, and that could be for on-farm practice, but it also could be business advice, for example. And we have a variety of different, support mechanisms which could provide those right now, but also in the future. So we haven't got to the detail of exactly how and what advice is accessed, but I think the commitment from government is to make sure that farmers aren't asked to make this transition to the new proposals on their own. We want to make sure that there is complementary advice and support along every step of the journey.
One question here about simplification has been promised, yet in a very long section of the white paper, you have both cross-compliance and civil sanctions in the new scheme. Yeah.
So cross-compliance, for any farmer out there, I'm sure, might agree, well, I would agree that, the current cross-compliance regulations are fairly complex. What we're seeking to do is to simplify those. So if you take that as our existing baseline, I mean, that's, cross-compliance is in operation and has been in operation for farms, across Wales under the Common Agricultural Policy, and it's underpinned by domestic legislation. What we want to do is take the opportunity to simplify that existing regime. So yeah, we do reference it. It is our existing baseline. We're not looking to push that baseline, upwards in future, and we're certainly not looking to push it downwards, because we're very proud of our high standards that we, farm producing food in Wales. So maintaining that kind of level of standard, but crucially making it simpler for people to understand what is the law and what isn't the law, taking out things which are perhaps not relevant anymore, and putting in place a proportionate enforcement regime is our proposal. So we do talk, I mean, I kind of accept in the white paper we do talk about regulation, perhaps a little more than anyone would hope to see, but I can't stress enough that the policy intent behind that is to try and simplify the existing legislative framework.
Thank you, James. There's a few questions here as well about the human resource that's needed to undertake the work on farm as regards to the assessments on farm.
Yeah.
And yeah, the number perhaps of consultants needed as well for the advisory service. Any thoughts on how are we going to get enough people to complete that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges and one of the reasons for having an extended transition period. And I think we recognise that, as I said before, different types of different farm businesses might require different types of advice. Some may require very little, some may require slightly more to enable them to make the transition into the new scheme. And I think we want to make it as flexible and accessible as we possibly can by providing that advice. But we also recognise that it's got to be paid for, and it's a government-backed advisory service, and we have to demonstrate that it's delivering value for money over that period of transition. But I think So I think we absolutely do hear about, the kind of fear, if you like, of, armies of consultants wandering around Wales, providing advice, and the money effectively then not going to the people who are undertaking the action that we want. We are acutely conscious of that in building a kind of proposition for advice, if you like, which reflects that, each farm is slightly different and may require something different. But, value for money will be a key consideration of our advisory service proposals.
And one question, because this is a Farming Connect event, will there be support through Farming Connect to develop pilot schemes to guide transition, especially in the area of environment and public goods?
So we, of course, we're well aware of the schemes that Farm Connect already run around pilot schemes, and I think as our scheme development proposals develop, as they continue to develop, looking to embed some of those proposals in perhaps some of those pilot schemes or widen that through the Farming Connect programme would seem to me, a really good opportunity to showcase really how effective this new scheme could be, what it would mean for farmers, and to enable some of that kind of knowledge transfer and information sharing to happen as well. So it seemed to be an obvious place to look.
I'm conscious of the time, and it's coming up to 8:30, and we did say that we'd finish within the hour. We've got over 150 questions that we could go through, but obviously we won't. I think I've bombarded you with plenty of questions as it is. We'll just finish off with one question, because one perhaps area that I haven't touched on tonight is the tenants.
Yeah.
So what are your views really on how this is going to affect the tenant sector?
So, Minister is really clear that if it doesn't work for tenants, the new scheme doesn't work for tenants, and it doesn't work. So, we, there are proposals in the white paper around tenancy. So again, anyone who's interested in those, dig around in the white paper a little bit, and by all means send us in your views and opinions. But we do need to make the scheme work for tenants. And everything that we've talked about in the new scheme is to reward the active farmer, so the farmer who manages their land, who undertakes action on their land. That is our prerogative here. And where that's the tenant farmer, obviously, that we want to make sure that they're rewarded commensurate with the effort they put in. So we have to make it work for tenant farmers.
Well, thank you very much, James. I am conscious of the fact that we haven't answered, there's so many questions that have been unanswered, but as I said at the beginning, we will, Welsh Government will be providing written answers. So I think we've taken the full hour, so I think it's time to bring the meeting to a close. Hoffwn ni, falle just dweud yn gryno ar y diwedd, os i chi yn chwilio am gymorth gyda cyswllt ffermio i helpu chi i gynllunio ymlaen, mae gyda ni yma bob amser i roed y cymorth yna iddo chi. Anyone wishing to receive support through Farming Connect to help with planning ahead, then we've got various interventions within the programme that can help you, from the advisory service through to perhaps just an hour on the phone with an expert, and that's 100% funded. So just get in touch with us. Dewch i gysylltiad gyda ni, unrhyw beth gallai'r cyswllt ffermio i wneud i helpu i ni yma i wneud hynny. Felly, gyda hynna o eiriau, hoffwn ni ddiolch yn fawr iawn i James am roed i amser yma heno i roed y cyflwyniad a hefyd i ateb yr holl gwestiynau. Diolch i chi wrth gwrs am ymuno gyda ni heno, a diolch i Hefin ac i Ffion hefyd am eu gwaith nhw trwy'r nos. Felly, gyda hynna o eiriau, jyst annog chi i gofio roi eich ymatebion i mewn i'r ymgynghoriad yma fydd yn cael ar y 5 o Fawrth. Felly, gyda hynna o eiriau, diolch yn fawr iawn a noswaith dda i chi gyd.